This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ICG's Digital Academy webinar series. Can I just check that it is recording? Yeah, that's fine.
It looks as though
Welcome,
it is.
everyone. Thank you. I'm Lucy Wernick, the ICG Manager. For today's webinar, we're delighted to welcome Alex Clark, Dan Young, David Spencer and Conrad Kaleo, our 4 finalists of the 2022 Award for Independent Consultants, with Conrad as our winner. Each in turn will give you a taster of their submission, which will hopefully give you an idea of the sorts of things the judges were impressed with. You'll have the opportunity to ask them questions. Please type these into the chat box as they go along, or unmute yourselves at the end of the session and ask them then. The 2023 award will be open for submissions in May, so it's not too early to start thinking about what you could do to enter. If you have any questions about the award, feel free to email Matt Kirby, the committee member responsible for the award, on award@theicg.co.uk. This webinar programme wouldn't be possible without the support of our sponsors. Today's webinar is generously sponsored by Indiefield. Contact Tara Lyons on tara.lyons@indiefield.co.uk or www.indiefield.co.uk for more information. Before I hand over to our finalists, here are some more webinars and events that we have planned for you over the next few weeks. Don't forget that we are able to offer great value sponsorship opportunities for each of these sessions, so please contact me if you're interested in finding out more about that. So now I'm going to hand over to Alex, our first finalist.
Hello, please could you enable me to share? There we go. Okay, so, right, so lovely to meet you all and to have this opportunity to tell you a little bit about our interesting research that we feel really privileged to actually have been able to do, and we're interested in seeing what you think about it. So please ask questions afterwards. So as we know, if we cast our minds back to the pandemic, although probably none of us really want to do that, lots of people spent more time online than they would normally do. And they were looking for questions around what the vaccine is and can it be trusted? And unfortunately, in today's online environment, it's quite easy to fall down into these conspiracy rabbit holes. And lots of the algorithms also feed you more of the information that you're looking for, which results often in confirmation bias. And all of this information is easily spread on social media, shared between friends and family that people trust, which is another factor that is important to think about, especially when the government was seen to not be trusted. And during that time, lots of scandals were happening. So that's kind of the backdrop of what was happening. So our client, the Royal Institution, was particularly interested in understanding what types of people are into these conspiracy theories, and why don't they want the vaccine, and what can they do about it. So it was a collaboration between Valent Projects, ourselves, and a influencer called Abigail Thorne, and her channel is called Philosophy Tube and has 1.29 million followers. So the idea was kind of to use the same mechanisms that some of these people who send out misinformation online, and yeah, to use their kind of tools, but obviously to share correct information. So Valent Project, that specialized in disinformation, was trawling through all of these Facebook groups, and looked at various profiles to try to understand what kinds of people were liking these misinformation vaccine pages, and came up with 4 different audiences. And what we then did was we recruited those 10 people that we had identified corresponded to the profiles through various statements. And we got them into an online community, and we used some different mental models to try to understand how they thought about health and trusts, their experiences of the pandemic, the vaccine, and how they thought about it. And we also got them to interview their family members and friends, so that we got a little bit more context from their home environment and how they spoke about it with that immediate environment. We then went into the homes of 5 of them that we selected from the online community, to really meet with them and get them and give them an opportunity to open up and have a empathetic conversation about how they were feeling about everything, which they really appreciated. And that resulted in an video, ethnographic insight video, a report, which was both a combination of insights and strategy, and a public report. And we don't have time, unfortunately, to look through some of the insights, but just sort of 3 key things I'd like to share with you is that we found that there were actually a lot of misunderstandings that people had picked up on through friends and family that they trusted and thought were telling them the right thing, and through online misinformation. So it's important to address some of those misunderstandings, because things like it's been rushed, vaccine's been rushed, it's a situation where it's not safe. They had sort of a miscalculated risk. Sorry, it was a miscalculated risk factor here, and but also it's important to communicate that in an empathetic way, not just talking about the facts on their own. And with mistrust in the government, and even in science, thinking that science and scientists have been compromised due to the government sort of forcing them down the wrong route, as we saw with Donald Trump, for instance. It's important to have someone who can speak truth to power, who maybe comes as an independent person. And that's why our influencer, Abigail, was particularly suited to talk about this. So she was able to take our insights and create this fantastic YouTube video, which both gave sort of historical context to vaccines in general. She was able to speak to some of those fears and misunderstandings that we had picked up on in our research. And through that sort of combination of a fact-based approach with an empathetic way of communicating these findings, the video received over 1 million views. It's actually 1.1 million at this point. So I do encourage you to both see the video, and of course, if you want to hear more about the research, you can go to our website and download the public report. So that is all from me. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you, Alex. So, any questions? Anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask Alex anything now? If not, I will hand over to Dan. All okay, Dan?
I believe so, yes. Hold on a second. Okay.
Brilliant.
Okay. So thank you, Alex. That's really, really interesting. And I'm going to talk about something slightly different, probably something slightly less topical, but hopefully something that you come into contact with in your day-to-day world quite a lot. So um, uh, just to say, happy to be here today, and great to be sharing this story with you, and very happy to be the bridesmaid to Conrad's bride as well. Focus isn't really on primary research. So I tend to help organizations, people, clients use research that they've already got, effectively synthesizing that rather than just commissioning new research. And my entry for this award was doing exactly that synthesis work. I did it for Futures Housing Group, Housing Association in the East Midlands. They've got about 10,000 homes and plans to build more. The project was effectively working on their performance reporting. So the performance reports that go to the board of the Housing Association tell them how they're performing as an organisation. So we use the systems thinking approach to deal with a huge amount of data that there is within the organisation and that actually was going to the board, to try to just tell better stories with it. Really, it was telling stories with data, but also taking an organisation on a journey. So taking them on a journey from thinking about individual silos to thinking about the whole system, to thinking about how their different bit of the business actually contributes to the overall customer experience. So I've got 7 slides to go through. I'll cover 3 things here today. So the challenge that we faced, how we overcame that challenge, and the lessons that we learned. If you are interested to know more, I presented this at the MRS Storytelling Conference and to Aura as well, if you're aware of the client-side organisation. So there are sort of fuller versions of this. Happy to send links afterwards if you are interested. So I think at a headline level, the challenge we faced was quite simple. The board of futures saw reports every quarter to tell them how things were going, how they were performing in terms of the income of the organisation, voids, so the period that properties were vacant between tenancies, repairs, assets, customer satisfaction, all those sorts of things. The problem was these things were quite restricted by rigid templates that had been used for years. They were quite focused on individual elements of the organization. So income, for example, came from the finance department, as you can imagine, but it didn't really reflect the interdependencies of different departments. So the original report may have showed that actually we had a really fast void turnaround, as they would call it. So the point between someone moves out and someone moves in. So that's great because there's a short period where we're not getting any income, so we want to reduce that as much as possible. However, if you turn around a property too quickly, you probably haven't carried out the necessary maintenance and repairs on the property, so the person moving in has quite a bad experience. So actually better sometimes to spend a bit of time and then people move into a nice property if they live in a nice property, sort of broken windows sort of philosophy that they're more likely to look after that property in the future. So it wasn't really acknowledging those sorts of, say, interdependencies. And nothing was linked to the new corporate plan. So in 2020, they'd launched a new corporate plan, but the reports themselves were just reporting various metrics, no clear link to the corporate plan. So we use this systems thinking approach to acknowledge those interdependencies, acknowledge how different departments work together, and talk more about customers and customer journeys. So we went through a really, really careful 5-stage process. I won't go through that. The ultimate aim of this was really to come up with a prioritised list of questions which, if answered, would tell the board how the business was performing and how it was performing against its strategic objectives. So quite simple, really. Obviously, the process was much more complicated. We had to take a whole organisation on a journey. We had to talk about individual customer journeys, and we identified 8 key ones. We had a workshop about each. These were about 2 hours long, huge investment of their time. And these were quite generative. We were looking to identify as many questions as possible that could be answered. And from those hundreds of questions, we then went through a prioritization exercise. Okay, these are the questions we could answer. Which are the important ones? Which have the strongest strategic link? And then after that, actually, do we have the sources to answer these questions within the organization? If we don't, where else could we get that information? So very much we started quite expansively, and then we narrowed over time, various stages, various meetings, various conversations, to come to, in the end, just 4 slides. So just 4 slides would go to the board. So from the original 8 journeys and all of those hundreds of questions, we actually said what you need to know is how you're managing the moving process. So that's the sort of void turnaround that I described. How you're managing tenancies from that point on, so long-term things like customer satisfaction, arrears, those sorts of things. How you look after your homes, so that's how you repair them in the short term and how you maintain them in the long term, and how you deal with complaints. Each slide had no more than 3 or 4 key insights in simple sentences, no more than 4 charts. Some had 3, some had 4, and a RAG status at the top, which quite clearly said, these are the questions we're trying to answer here. This is how it links to your strategy, and this is at a high level how you're performing. So really, really joined up. The idea being, if you just provide the essential information, you're more likely to have constructive conversations at a board level rather than get into the minutiae and into the detail. One of the things we made sure that these templates was really, really flexible. So in the future, different things will become important on a given quarter. Different metrics are important, so they could be adapted. So they're a template, but they're very much able to evolve with the needs of the organisation. But very, very joined up, very, very systems thinking. So what did we learn? So we always said it was, the whole project felt a bit like a marathon, or at least training for a marathon. So for us, the success came in the timing, actually. We were very, very lucky that we started our training, if you like, in the spring when the sun was shining. We didn't start in winter. So we had a receptive board, we had a receptive CEO. The board and CEO were looking to move to more of a sort of generative role where they were focused on the high level strategy rather than the internal sort of machinations of the organisation. So they were very, very open to new ideas. The new strategy had just been launched as well, so everyone was talking about the strategy. So it just felt like a really good time to take them on this sort of journey. We didn't try to do too much, so we started small. We were walking before we were running. We got sign off at every stage for each iteration, each prioritization. We actually launched with only a single slide of the 4 with real data in, just to prove that this could work and show the benefit of this kind of approach to move people on from what they'd had before. We work together, just makes training better, doesn't it? So we made sure that people knew how important this was. We had the CEO involved at a launch meeting when we started the project, just to keep motivation levels, energy levels high, because a lot of time that we were asking of people. But we made sure that we kept focusing on that finish line, the goal. We didn't get sidetracked in any of our conversations. And you can imagine running 8 workshops about the questions that need to be answered for a business. We generated so much content. A lot of it was really, really useful, but it wasn't about how the business was performing, and it wasn't about the strategy. So we had to park a lot of questions about the future direction of the organisation, different departments. We just made sure that we kept focusing on what we were there to do. We had a clear schedule, though. We were very, very open about how long the process would take and the different stages as we went through. We had to be flexible. We had to adapt. There was the tail end of a pandemic that we were dealing with at the time. So like any good training, occasionally you miss a run. So we made sure that we could adapt within our sort of schedule. And we just made sure that it was fun. We were asking people to spend 2 hours times 8 on Zoom, having very lengthy, very detailed conversations. So we used all the usual qualitative tricks and moderation facilitation tricks that we had, just to keep it really engaged. We had prizes at the end of the project for best range of Nordic jumpers or best background display of exercise equipment, that sort of stuff. Just keep it light. We had a prize draw as well. So we just used all the techniques that you might have used with consumers, but within an organization, just to make sure that people engage. And we got more out of the project as a result. So that's a whistle stop tour, more of a sprint than a marathon, probably. Hopefully, gives you an idea of the project and what we went through and what we achieved. I think I'll hand back to Lucy if you've got any questions.
Yeah, any questions, as ever, unmute yourself, feel free to ask or put them in the chat box. And at the same time, I will hand over to David. David, I got your message. I will nudge you if you run over.
Okay. Okay. Just trying to. Oh, I'm trying to. Share my screen.
Okay.
Is that?
We can see your screen, but I don't think we can see your slides.
Can you see my slide now?
Not yet.
Oh, forgive me.
If not, I may jump to Conrad and then come back to you, if that would help.
Okay. Sure. Okay.
Conrad, is that okay?
Sure thing. Good job on paying attention, isn't it? Bear with me 1 second. Can you see my screen? My slides?
Yep.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Fantastic. Cool. All right. So this is, I'm going to take you through a project that we did on behalf of Channel 4, a client with whom we work quite a lot. And this, in some ways, is your classic content or program development piece of work, but with a bit of a twist. So the context here is all important, really. Channel 4 is a broadcaster that continues to have its traditional remit of serving 16 to 34s with content that is a little bit alternative, that reflects the diversity and speaks up for the minorities of the United Kingdom and beyond. Clearly, TV is changing in terms of the way it is distributed, and that has some impact on the nature of the content as well. In this case, All 4, which is Channel 4's video on demand service, is, as you might imagine, a central plank of their strategy to reach 16 to 34s. And the ambition for All 4, when this project was commissioned, was to double its audiences by 2025. And clearly that has a commercial imperative to safeguard the broadcaster's future. At the time, there was a lot of talk about privatization. And factual and current affairs programming is a big part of that. Numbers show that young audiences are very interested in factual narrative storytelling, and within that, current affairs. And so the ambition was to invest £10 million over 3 years in digital first foreign factual and current affairs content, but it was unclear what content that should be, who it should be for, and how Channel 4 should brief producers. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the ins and outs of how TV works, and especially Channel 4 does not make any of its own content, so it relies on the independent production sector to populate its channels and its on-demand properties, which means it has to write briefs for the kind of thing that it might want, so that it gets ideas back that are useful for Channel 4. The previous research had shown that what had once been a strength of Channel 4 has become a weakness, and it was unclear to the audience what Channel 4 stood for in factual and current affairs particularly, and the audience was dwindling. So part of this was a content development piece, but there were also other bits to it in terms of maximizing efficiency in acquiring and retaining new audiences. And that's not just done through editorial, as we were saying in the TV industry, so not just by making programs, but also by, in aggregate, those programs standing for something and paying back to the Channel 4 brand, also in marketing the programs, and also simply in the user experience of using the on-demand platform. So quite a lot to do, and unlike Dan, who managed to boil his stuff down into 4 slides, we had to go the other way and give commissioners and the Channel 4 Insight team chapter and verse. So I'm going to take you through a whistle-stop tour of the kinds of things we did rather than exactly what we found. So hopefully it's okay. We can talk about what we found as well, if you'd like. It was a qualitative piece using the same platform that Alex used on her project. 48 participants, doing loads of different stuff, quite zoomed out things about their media behaviours when it comes to factual and current affairs, and then really zoomed in things on what we would call executional detail, so how to make a programme. But clearly you can't ask people directly, how do you make a programme, or what do you like? People don't remember that. So all manner of interesting and stimulus-led techniques to get to the bottom of what works and what doesn't work, and then some follow-up Zoom interviews. So really big data set amongst a broad range of young people. As I said, this project operated on 2 levels, really, and the program makers are incredibly interested in the fine detail of things like, should we have 2 presenters or 1? Should it be a young man and an older woman, or something like that? That's the way that they tend to think, and quite often they can miss some of the big sweeps in culture and in society that influence changes in something that they've known very well, making TV programs. So to contextualize those specific executional insights that we were tasked with giving, we also provided a set of framing thoughts, and we do this quite often. And these framing thoughts, what they do is they set up a foundational model that helps explain the insights that follow. They help kind of contextualize all the executional stuff. So in this instance, we provided the client with a category typology, so how the audience sort of thinks about factual and current affairs. It won't surprise you that they don't think of it as factual and current affairs. There's essentially anything that's non-fiction is factual in the audience mind, and then they subdivide it. And it's probably more helpful for a broadcaster to think about the world in those terms, in the consumer's terms or in the audience's terms, than it is in the TV industry's terms. We also provided an audience typology, actually a couple, because engagement with factual content and engagement with current affairs content were subtly different. So we sort of gave them some idea of who they might want to target and with what kind of content. And then once we'd done that, we provide an analysis of Channel 4 factual and current affairs from the audience perspective, so essentially how it's perceived and how it's positioned. That's a lot of detail, and you can see just by the number of slides that I'm showing you here how much we had to give. And so it really helps, especially with non-research literate or non-research savvy audiences. These are creative people who like stories. So when we're dealing with commissioners especially, but generally we all like stories, we try to give one easy to grasp analogy right, as a hook, and then we can hang the insights from those. And sometimes it's very obvious what that is. Sometimes it can be more tricky. Here we talked about the new world and the old world of content, and to that we tied, these ideas of tele and digitally native content, and from that we can then hang both the big insights, but also some of the more executional detail. So having laid that groundwork, we got into the specifics of topics, tone, treatment, talent, casting, all the stuff that program makers think that they really need and want at the beginning, and they do. But actually, when we finish these kinds of work, usually they say it's those framing thoughts that really help me, because now I can go off and I understand the sort of the lie of the land a little bit better, and I can and I can start to commission against that lie of the land. The tectonic plates are shifting somewhat in something that I felt that I knew inside. So we're providing here detail about what kinds of presenters, for example, what sorts of topics, potentially. But actually, the project found that anything can be interesting, really, as long as it's done in a tonally interesting way and treated in an interesting way, and that we gave them insight into what interesting looked like for these different kinds of audience that we'd identified in our typologies. Then we summed up with a bunch of recommendations on where Channel 4 can take its factual and current affairs content, where it needs to move to, how it can do so executionally, who it's trying to target. And ultimately, what we ended up doing was informing the commissioning briefs that went out to the production industry, to inform how that £10 million will be spent on content. All four was reorganised to subdivide what was the documentaries category into something that more fit into that mental model of how audiences think about everything that is non-fiction. And so that's an easy win, or an easier win than having to come up with new brands, which is expensive and risky. But actually, in this case, we did also inform the development of a totally new strand called Untold, and you can see some of it here on the right-hand side of my screen, which is a brand that is kind of almost like an entry-level brand for current affairs for 16 to 24-year-olds, which we identified was a kind of critical juncture in getting people into current affairs, and they kind of need a lot of explainer content and a lot of stuff that isn't too dry, and lots of other executional detail. So that is a whistle-stop tour of the project, and with that I will stop sharing my screen and hand back to Lucy, I believe.
Thank you. Thank you, Conrad. As ever, any questions? Just unmute yourselves. Feel free. Maybe a story.
Given the large sample, how come you chose qualitative methods? Yeah.
Well, when you say the large sample, 48 people.
It's quite a lot to analyze qualitatively.
It is. Yeah. You're right. It is. But we don't feel that content development is. Content development traditionally is not done quantitatively, because there's so much fine detail. It's so stimulus driven. You can't really. You can quantify it if you've got a load of qual insights, but you can't really get into the level of nuance in a quantitative methodology that you can. So I don't think we're doing it quantitatively, because it's fundamentally a creative exercise, essentially.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Okay, we've got an opportunity to ask questions to any of our four presenters at the end as well. So I'm actually going to hand over to Sally now, and Sally is going to show David's slides. So Sally.
I've rebooted the app, so if you want to see if it will work, just for a moment.
Well, let's just We've got that as an option, David. Is Sally there?
Yes, can you hand over to me?
You are already.
Oh, okay. Okay. What can you see?
Yeah, David's slides. We just need them on full screen.
Okay, let me see if I can get them to full screen. What can you see now?
Okay, that's it.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay,
Right.
good. Right.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. Sorry about the tech glitch. I feel well. Congratulations, Conrad. What an amazing piece of work. Very good, and Alex and Dan too. I feel a little bit of a fraud because this is a collaboration. This project with Alison Lyon from Counterpoint, who did a lot of the heavy lifting, and Richard Clark, who's deeper, very, very clever, deeper quant technique. Just helped enormously. I know Richard's here, so I don't want to big him up too much. This project was for Central Co-op Funeral Care. And Sally, if you can just click the next slide through. And and again, and what I found personally, it's just so different talking to people about funerals than it is about talking to them about beer or cars or groceries. We were talking to people about things that were deeply, deeply important to them. And that placed a lot of pressure on us as researchers because we needed to respect this, and also we needed to put people's well-being very clearly in the front of our mind. We were very careful to make sure that we checked in with them both before and after the interviews. So Sally, and if you can click a couple of times, a few bullet points will come up. Thank you. Thank you. The thing about funerals, if any of you have been to a funeral recently, is funerals haven't changed very much for maybe 50 or 100 years. They're still pretty much the same, but society has. Society has changed enormously. And the co-op, I don't think were villains in any way. I think the whole category it has been very comfortable serving up white British Christian funeral services. And if that's you and your family, then the whole thing works quite well. But if you're not religious, or you're from a non-British cultural background, or if you're a humanist, or if you are non-religious, or if environmental or natural considerations were top of your mind, then it felt very awkward on both sides of the supplier-customer relationship. Something that Alison called the Chinese restaurant syndrome, where you would sit down and someone would have a big form and say, right, coffin, what kind of coffin do you want? And handles, tell me about the handles. Hymns, hearses. It was almost like a series of tick boxes. And people felt nudged into this even when it wasn't right for them. And we spoke to many people who followed this process. They described it as like being on a conveyor belt, and they regret it forever because they have a funeral that didn't feel right for the person who has died, for the person they loved. And it was very, very important. So, Sally, this slide is not ours, but has been in the media quite a lot. You may have seen it on news reports, and indeed it's been referred to a number of times within the ICG group. We all know Britain's a very diverse society. It's becoming rapidly less religious. So increasingly, society is out of sync with this sort of white British Christian funeral protocol. And so more and more people are finding it more and more difficult to get the funeral that's right for them, for their needs. Thanks, Sally. And again, 2 or 3 points here on this slide. So thank you. So our initial brief was to explore what people wanted who did not want a traditional funeral, who did not want hymns and hearses. Now that was a pretty tough brief to begin with. We're talking to people who are in emotional turmoil, talking to people who are emotionally very raw, about things that are deeply important to them, and often about things that they hadn't spoken about before. And then came COVID, and COVID came along, and all of a sudden the rules for funerals seemed to be changing almost month by month. Only 6 people, no singing, no attendance. Um, so we needed to be very quick and very agile. And so we had a client who knew that fundamentally they needed to change and quickly against this constantly changing backdrop. Thanks, Sally. Um, and essentially the brief was, we know we need to change, but we don't know what. So they were really quite unsure about what to do. Sally, please click through. Thanks. Um, and we use this approach that we call braided research, and we use this. I've used it a number of times when a client knows that something fundamental needs to change, but they're really not sure what or how, or what needs to stay, what doesn't, what's the baby and what's the bathwater. And we break the research down into really kind of quite small chunks so that we have little looks at lots of things. So the wheel isn't a great big wheel which lasts for weeks and weeks. It's a small wheel that lasts for days. And each small step shaped the following ones. We did lots of different methodologies in this work. We spoke to multi-generational family interviews, which was fascinating, talking to grandparents and parents and grandchildren about funerals. So interesting. And the number of times that people said, we have never spoken about this before. This has actually been very good for us. Each small step shaped what we needed to do for the next step. And I have to pay tribute to the client. Our primary client was a woman called Alexandra American at the Co-op, because it takes courage to enter into this process not knowing where it's going to take you. They're taking a big risk. And it also takes courage for them to get involved directly, personally. It really did feel like a joint endeavor between ourselves, our clients, and the participants. And we needed to have open channels of communication with the client throughout. We had some very frank conversations with the client, completely open conversations about things we were confident about, things we weren't confident about, things we know, things that we should know, but we haven't. So it's very, very good for building client relationships. Thank you, Sally. And indeed with participants, we carried on this conversation with selected participants over weeks or months. In actual fact, I do know that the client, even 6 or 9 months later, is still in contact with some of these participants, because now they're at the stage where they're redesigning their funeral homes in the light of these insights. And she's still checking things against some of the people that we spoke to. So it had a very long tail. We didn't speak to people just once. We also caught their subsequent reflections and further thoughts. Thanks, Sally. So the key outcomes. Thank you, Sally. Yes, different families do have very, very different needs following a death. Different cultures do, different religions do. You have very different needs if a person has died who's quite old and their death was expected, or if it is an unexpected younger death. And I can't say what it is, but we uncovered a real deep core truth that allowed all families to come together in remembrance and celebration and comfort and healing. And it was one of those insights that once it's revealed, once it's unearthed, it kind of, in retrospect, feels quite obvious. A little bit like years and years ago on Nurofen, we talked about gentle strength, or some of the car insights like ultimate driving machine and so on. And it was a simple but universal and deep thing. And these simple truths can actually cause a whole organization to pivot, which is what happened here. It's transformed the business, and it's moved the business from selling packages to truly being customer centric. And their strategic vision has changed, their brand design has changed, their website has changed, their communications have changed. They now train their staff differently. They even design their premises differently now in the light of these insights. And the brand is now relevant to everybody in Britain, regardless of your beliefs or your ethnicity or faith or your culture. It was very well set up for a shrinking segment, and now it's much more broad. Thank you. And purely on a business level, their market share has increased significantly. The number of funerals that they are now providing has grown significantly. And from a business point of view, the amount of money that their customers spend have all increased significantly. So it's also transformed the business. And I think my final point, for me, I think the most important thing is that this business is now so much better at dealing with people when they're at their most vulnerable, when they're in the most need. And this lifetime of regret hopefully happens less and less and less. I actually do think that as a piece of market research, we often talk to people in great depth about things that are not that important. I think in this project, we talk to people in great depth about things that are very, very important. I think that's it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, all four of you. Fantastic and so interesting to hear those summaries. I'm just going to put my camera on. Does anybody have any questions for any of our presenters?
I think there was some for David in the chat box.
Well, it was someone just saying congratulations. Second, I'll just put it up. Sounds as though this was an incredibly rewarding project. Congratulations to you and all the finalists, from Becky. And then Becky's got another question. I'm interested in how or if you incentivize participants in this context, especially given the long tail. I think that's to David.
We offered incentives in kind of pretty much the standard qualitative research way. A lot of people told us they didn't want to be paid. A lot of people told us that they wanted to contribute towards it. So we offered incentives. We also offered, if people preferred, that they could make a contribution to a charity, which some people did. But it wasn't really an issue. I mean, the incentives was probably a bit less of an issue for our participants than it might be in many of the projects, but completely standard process regarding incentives. And if we talked to people a number of times, each time we spoke to them, we incentivized them. We also had a platform where people could drop in, and we could drop them an email to say something has, there's an issue we'd like some feedback on, and they would just drop in social media style to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down or a comment for which they weren't incentivized. Yeah, I still get emails from people saying I've driven past such and such a premise, and I see that they've changed the design of the premises, which is quite satisfying.
Anybody else? Anyone? Okay. I think that's probably it. I suspect if all four of you are open to receiving questions by email afterwards, hopefully you are. You can find all four finalist details on our website. So I think that's probably it. So thank you so much, all four of you, for all the work all the way through in submitting, and also congratulations and thank you for today. I've got some nice comments coming in. Thank you. Well done, everyone. Brilliant. We'll close it now. Everybody have a lovely day. Hope to see some of you at the Lunch and Learn at 1 o'clock today. Thanks a lot.
Yes. Thank you.